All right, let's get started. So our plan here is about 30 minutes of discussion between myself and Richard and Paula. And then open up to questions for 15, 20 minutes, whatever you all got. Again, we're a little snug in here, but I think it works well. I referred in the invitation that you got if you're in my class that Richard's the OG of the carbon markets. He essentially invented these markets. Anything you study around carbon markets, European climate exchange, voluntary carbon markets, any of that, it's because this guy invented them. So, as a result, I thought we'd have a really interesting conversation. And Paula was there through it all.
Right.
Richard and I go back a few years, a few decades, maybe a century or two. We go back a little ways. Known each other a long time. And it's really a pleasure to have him here and talking about his work and how he and Paula put this whole thing together. So I want to start with the title of this book, Carbon Hunters. How do you come up with the title? What's the title all about?
When I was a kid, growing up, my dad had an interest in science, and there was a book called Microbe Hunters, which described the birth of the microscope and also Pasteur, and Dr. Paul Ehrlich, who was the father of immunology and won a Nobel Prize in 2007. And among the things he did, he invented a drug called Salvarsan 606, which was an early treatment for syphilis. And it was called 606 because he got it wrong 605 times. And that's kind of a metaphor for Paula and I and this Carbon Hunters, because economists, as Bruce knows, often assume there's a market for widgets, and that's not what it's about. It is building institutions, and it is a complex mixture of law, sociology, economics, computer tech, accounting, finance, and it's a very hard thing to build one. And so Paul and I got it wrong a lot, but we ultimately got it right,
which is always all that matters. Okay, that's a great background. Great start. How do you guys end up, what was the collaboration? Give us the backstory on how you ended up working together.
Paula, go ahead.
So no two people were less destined to meet than Richard Sandor and me. I wanted to get a PhD in comparative literature at NYU. I didn't get the fellowship. I became a journalist. I started covering public schools in New York City. And I decided to volunteer to work for Jacques Cousteau. Remember that word, volunteer. So I volunteered to work for Jacques Cousteau, who some of you may know invented the scuba and basically underwater filming. And he needed a writer for a project. So I go to work for him. And I was ready to leave, but then he and I hit it off. So he said, why don't you stay, work on the films? And he, having observed in a lifetime or less the deterioration of the oceans, he moved from being a filmmaker to a policy advocate. So in 1992, which probably nobody except a handful of us were born, but remember 92, because that's when the climate change problem became an international problem. And there were no financial people at that Earth Summit, hardly any. Lou Preston, who ran the World Bank, had such an empty calendar, his secretary called me, did Jacques Cousteau want to have lunch with him? So capital was not present, except in the person of Richard. So anyway, Richard can tell what he did at Rio. What I did at Rio was in Rio de Janeiro. Cousteau, everybody wanted to be with him, and he was lobbying strongly all these presidents. In fact, we'd been to the White House twice to see George Bush to get him to go. I personally think I was the person who got him to go. We said
got him to go to Rio.
Got him to go to Rio and to sign.
Yeah.
And to sign, because we argued that if every other country was signing, there would be advantages. And if the U.S. was not in the treaty, there would be disadvantages. But anyway, fast forward, I was doing my thing with Cousteau, trying to get him in position to make his policy arguments. And I did not know that Richard was there. But let him say what he was doing, and then I return to how we met later.
What were we doing?
Yeah, I was in a tent on this. They had unofficial NGO spaces, and I had been invited because I worked on the acid rain program, which was a big problem in the U.S., and got invited to Geneva to talk about markets, and then they lit up, the UNCTAD did, and said, oh, we're having this thing in Rio, why don't you come and deliver a paper? So I wrote a paper for the architecture of a worldwide carbon trading system, and I got there, and my wife Ellen and I had lived in Berkeley in the 60s. I'm 800 years old, so I taught there in the 60s, and I had not seen as much tie-dye and Grateful Dead paraphernalia since the 60s. And I came home and I said, this is for real. This is a movement, and it could catch on. I gave the paper. I went out on the beach in Ipanema, had a Caparini, and I said, I think I can do this. This is possible. So we didn't meet, and then...
So just in a room like this, so you probably know COP 30 just happened, right? That's 30 years.
It's COP 28. That's
So 92 wasn't even numbered.
Right.
You know, COP 1 was some years after that. So we're talking 35 years since this original discussion. So remember that. The science has not stopped 1 minute. But so there was a meeting like this. So there was a bill to implement the agreements at Rio. I think they put a $125 billion a year number on that. And nobody had an idea how to raise that money. So there was a meeting in 95 in Glen Cove, New York, out on Long Island. It was called the Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Financing Agenda 21. And Cousteau was invited. He was on that high-level advisory board. Boutros Boutros-Ghali was the Secretary General. And Richard was invited also. So it's just exactly a table like this. International bankers, all kinds of important UN types. And don't ever do this. But everyone who came to that meeting came with a prepared script. And no matter what the person said that they sat next to, they just ignored it and said what they came to say, which made the meeting essentially neutral, right? And there's many, many times that happens. However, Richard was in his chair, and it's funny, it was a chair like this, I remember. He's sitting there, he swings back in the chair, he says, look, I don't know anything really about climate change, but I know a lot about trading. And I think trading will help climate change, but I know that we won't find out unless we try it. And then the person next to him went on with something else. And I'm sitting there saying, the guy just put something on the table and nobody picked it up. So I picked it up. And 3 years later, I became president of a big foundation in Chicago called the Joyce Foundation. Richard was in Chicago. I call him up on July 14, 1999. No, on July 5th, 1999. And I said, look, I was in the room when you said that. Do you want to try it? What would it take? I'm here. I got a $40 million portfolio of grants to give out. Let's talk about it. So on July 14th, 1999, we had lunch. And we were in a place where you couldn't use any paper. Was forbidden. And Richard basically gave the paper from Rio again over lunch, sketching out this architecture that I actually could see, having no markets background. But I understood what he just said, which was, this is not just about building a market. You're going to have to get publicity. You're going to get people buying in. You got to get people ready to take a risk. That's what philanthropy is supposed to do. Go where nobody else will go. And so the net result was Richard gave a fantastic presentation to our board. Barack Obama was on the board and was a big cheerleader. He was in the state Senate then, and we ended up giving, $1.5 million, something like that. It was a Millennium Grant, it was the year 2000. And that funded the original design, and the rest is sort of history.
Yeah, so I think I want to put it, because you are all academically, and let me just tell you what the theory looks like and then what the digging in the ditch looks like. So I'm going to show you something that looks like it. So if you take a look at this, if you look at a market in terms of things, if you can take a look, if you look at it, there are four quadrants that you have to look at, and those four quadrants, it's okay. There are four quadrants. You need legislative enabling, you need regulation, you need to build an exchange as an institution, and you need to write the specific terms of a contract to buy or sell. That doesn't matter if it's wheat, gold, treasury, bonds, stock indexes. Okay? So I use an acronym when I teach called SCITED, SCITED. The first thing you need to do is create scarcity. Okay, when you deal with markets, you have a limited supply of pollution, so you limit the amount that can have. Once you have limitations in an economic system, you need to make choices. That's the C. Once you make choices and design an institution and a contract and regulation, I is incentives. You have to create something that has incentives in it. The T is for transaction costs, because if it costs more to trade than the benefits of trade, going back to David Ricardo, the trade doesn't occur. The E is expectations, because economics is fundamentally about expectations, and it's particularly important in a market that might have government legislation. And the last is diversification. So it's scarcity, choice, incentives, transactions costs, expectations, and diversification. So that's the framework in which you look. Now, you have to go and go out and find people to participate. And I'm going to talk about just the initial 4 or 5, and then I'm going to talk to Paula about, because Paula not only headed a foundation, we later, after 9/11, became partners in a business sense, and she recruited and ran international in China.
Which became CCX. There was CCX.
Which, yes.
Okay. So just to put this in context, right? They create a carbon market. It's never been done before, but there's no government policy.
Right.
There's no government saying you must reduce emissions, let alone you must trade. Right? So how do you create a market out of nothing?
So you get on a plane, okay, and you make 115 separate visits. Not me, Paula, Mike Walsh, Raphael, and a team of whatnot. And you go and you grovel. Your knees are red from begging. And you crawl and you say to people, would you volunteer? And we discussed this in an article that we wrote for the Singapore Economic Review, and that is to remember there's an awful lot to be said, and economists don't, about endowment effects. And we created what we called a mutual endowment effect. People like to be members of the New York Stock Exchange. That's a badge of honor. They like to be alumni of the Columbia Business School, the science program, the masters that Bruce just is providing for lots of you guys. And to be alumni and to be part of a movement of change is often omitted in the economics of literature. So I went around and started asking people to voluntarily commit to a reduction of emissions in a 4-year pilot program. And we got 127 people. We eventually got it down to about 25 people who agreed. And it simply said, just to kind of induce them, I agree to be part of a design phase, and if and only if the outcome of this design fits every single corporate need you could imagine, then I'll join. So it was a formal letter that said nothing, right? It just bound them to participate. We tried to divide it into 3 separate groups, buyers and sellers, basically. So it was manufacturing, utilities, forest products, and farmers. So we wanted to get winners. And the idea of putting a price on carbon is it used to be that it paid to pollute. Our idea was to show people how it paid not to pollute, to create incentives so you would not pollute. And that's the simple twist on it. And it's nothing fancier than that. So we got down to a phase and we designed you got to name things. The French really know important about that, like wines and champagnes and things like that. So instead of calling it the Rio thing or the Kyoto Protocol, we called it the Chicago Accord. And instead of being 1,700 pages, it was 17 pages. And we set out the reduction schedule, who would be in it. It was really simple stuff. Then we said, all right, let's get down to the details. Manufacturing, how much will you cut? Utilities, how much will you cut? What will each particular people do it? And we wrote a list of rule books, and we translated the Chicago Accord into 101 books. And we had 4 or 5, and much of economics investments even are you need a lead dog, right? That's the key. Can you get a thought leader? So we got 4 people who were really primed, a couple of buyers and a couple of sellers. Among the manufacturers was Ford Motor Company, and there was a guy by the name of Martin Zimmerman, who was the chief economist, and he had Bill Ford's ear. And so he was key in designing it. Another one was Bruce Brain, who was on the board, an economist of American Electric Power. Then there was a guy by the name of Carlton Charles, who was at International Paper. And then the people at DuPont. And realize again, we're going at it in a very different way because we're including all 6 greenhouse gases, and that is a part of the design and contract. We didn't want carbon only, and Ford wanted to join expectations because they were going to be under the European ETS, and they had factories in Stuttgart and Marseille and all over, and they wanted to learn. DuPont, so they could pay a little to learn. DuPont, on the other hand, could switch refrigerants, which were very, very high in carbon impact, so they would be a seller. International Paper, one of the biggest landholders, could do forest management and reforestation, so they were in. And then American Electric Power was the biggest coal user in North America. I was on the board of that, so I had to recuse myself, but it was clear to them that there was no future for them in '02 or in '03, that coal was coming to the end, and they had to transfer to natural gas, renewables, transmission, distribution, etc. So the last part was to get them all to do it simultaneously. We had a very effective board. Rich Daley was the On the board, the governor of Illinois, Tom Lovejoy, Christy Todd Whitman. We had a really blue ribbon thing, so we finally said, you all have to announce simultaneously because nobody wanted to go first. They did. And then we went on to build the rest of it, and that Chicago Climate Exchange. And Paula, the bottom line is we had 108 emitters, 400 total members. The emissions of that group was the size of Germany, all voluntary. And we eventually cut emissions by what is France's current level of emissions. Paula, you want to pick up what we did after?
Well, I'll just embroider that a little bit. I mean, talk about today. It's hard to believe that when they had the Chicago Accord, which was the agreement, and then the rule book. You know, it was a lot of architecture to design this. Well, what's hard to believe is that all the people Richard mentioned believed that climate change was a problem. AEP knew they had to get out of coal. The world was ready to deal with the science, which, by the way, has been known since 18-something, that CO2 is not good for the atmosphere. And the scarcity is self-defined because it's a very thin wafer of atmosphere up there. And there was this latent appetite to act. And Rio had occurred. And everybody, there was all this momentum. Just think about the Paris Agreement, and you were born for that, I think. That was the last infusion of momentum. And maybe we're not going to see another one for another 10 years. So I don't want to get ahead of that. But the point is that at that moment, recruiting people was a matter of making the case that this is inevitable, it's good for your business, you're going to learn. And I had a wonderful assistant named Rowan Ma. We went around and I used to bring flowers to people, anything to get them to sign, anything, practically anything. And Rowan, we went to see a company, I won't name it, but they did eventually join and they became leaders. And he looked at all their products. Remember, no one had even done an inventory. No one even knew the term carbon footprint. We got these companies to actually do their first inventory of CO2 and other emissions in their North American operations. So that's Carbon Hunter. They had to go around, hunt and find these tons. And so we had a meeting with the CFO and a couple other people. Rowan did his homework. He looks at their product line. He puts up a slide and he says, 2 slides. These are the products that you sell now that you'll sell more of if there's a cap on carbon. And these are the products that you will probably sell less of if you don't join the Chicago Climate Exchange. And the CFO turns to his staff and he says, did we ever do a slide like that? And they had not. They had not looked at their product line in relationship to this requirement to eventually reduce emissions. So, it was a sales pitch, it all is, but it's always who you talk to. And without getting heavily onto the difference between when we did this and today, you could not do this online. No way.
Let's fast forward today in just one sec. But there's one group you haven't talked about yet, either Richard or Paula, because you talked about the business side, the trading side. Love the acronym. But in those days, and still sometimes to today, they're environmentalists who are very skeptical of using the market to address this problem. And I can imagine there were environmentalists who weren't entirely supportive of what you're trying to do. How did those conversations go? How do you win?
First of all, and let me start by saying my partner, Paula, is an environmentalist. So, she brought a series of credentials to her, having been an explorer, taking the Calypso 1,000 miles up the Amazon. So her bona fides as an explorer and as in a very different time, she was at the forefront. She's too modest to say it, but she was really out there in the jungles and looking around. And that was part of it. What we did was we got one group, and that was WRI.
Yeah, that was
a
important.
nonprofit, yeah.
And one nonprofit, Jonathan Lash, and they enjoyed. Now, and I have to say that there's a very important role for political advocacy, but we're in the business of solving problems, not identifying problems. So a lot of the environmental groups were in the problem of pushing for regulation, and we were self-regulated, and we were trying to prove it's a pilot. We didn't oppose regulation. It wasn't our job. So let's say that they viewed us with skepticism, and there were some stories that came out that weren't pleasant. But I think having WRI and having Paula and the fact that we were solving a problem, some people erroneously said that, when you get states, and Paula was at the forefront in recruiting counties and states and things like that, and people didn't like it because they thought if you were going to participate in a voluntary, you would relieve the need for binding legislation.
Right.
And that was the biggest. But we managed to live through it all by saying, okay, you identify problems, we solve them. We have WRI, we have the Joyce Foundation, we have Christy Todd Whitman. We're trying to appeal to the bipartisanly, the guns and rods folks who were often Republicans along with the Democrats. So we were trying to really be a bipartisan private sector, public-private partnership.
So things have changed a bit. Let's talk about the present and the future. That's what we're here about. Just not to skip over the fact that once the Chicago Climate Exchange was created, as you could tell, it got a lot of momentum. It was very successful. In 2010, it was acquired by Intercontinental Exchange, right?
Yeah, we set up a European exchange, which is today the largest, the EU ETS, and it was successful. We took it public in London at £1, and we sold it to the New York Stock Exchange for £7.50. So, and we gave
£7.50, just to multiply the shares, is about $600 million, which even then, that was real money. And tremendous success.
And we gave the Joyce Foundation, although we didn't have a grant of this nature, we just gave them
Value back.
$1 million in stock. So they made a multiple on that just because we thought it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. So big success, but now we're in a different era. Politically, we're in a different era.
Well, before we go on,
Right,
we have to mention that in addition to what Richard just said, and this is probably the thing that's going to be the most lasting and the most relevant today, since we're going into what's the story today, we launched the first carbon pilot in China, the Tianjin Climate Exchange, which
Yep.
opened in 2008. Now, you will be reading about ones that opened in 2010, 11, but ours was in 08. And that's a whole other topic, probably. But the point is that we were advising the government of China
Yep.
on everything as of about 2005 or 6. So they were, and Richard's too modest, but we did all these meetings, and we used to do this prep, and we were invited to the a meeting of the highest, narrowest, smallest, most elite team of advisors to the Communist Party about what was really going on with carbon markets. What were they, blah, blah.
The 5-year plan, people.
So, we're ready to, and all of a sudden the whole table is asking very intelligent questions. They have been researching carbon markets, I'll bet, for 35, 40 years at the least. Yeah. So what they're doing today, what we see today, is already old from the point of view of China. And our country, which is where I think you're going, is so hopelessly behind on all these, and it isn't only the politics, it's the absence of a risk-reward ratio. There's almost no reward for risk-taking in today's business world that I see.
Mm. So let's talk about today, and then just for a few minutes, and then I want to open up to questions, so there's a chance for everyone else. But go ahead, Richie.
No, I was just going to say, in spite of that,
Right.
Yeah.
I've never been more bullish. Paula and I have spoken. She's been in Hong Kong. I've been at Harvard and UCLA and the North American carbon world. the rooms are packed like this. There are either 20 at a university or 800 at North American Carbon World. Every one of these companies, like NVIDIA, and the people who you buy your products from, AI, are very sensitive to that carbon footprint. And I think and firmly believe that there's a Godfather 2 here for a child of CCX. We had to measure, Bruce, we had poverty projects in rural India, and we had environmentalists. We had agriculture with soil sequestration. We used to send inspectors with drones and AI and the monitoring and verification. What we did by hand.
Right. To do
You
like
can do
that.
a lot more efficiently now.
You
yeah.
could do now totally efficiently, and you could provide carbon sequestration for an acre of land in Indonesia and be able to monitor and verify it. And you could have never done that 25 years ago when Paula and I teamed up.
So putting aside politics for a moment, let's just talk about the voluntary carbon markets that exist today. They're very challenged, right? So what is it, from your experience, what criteria are the most important to ensure that those markets are successful today?
Before I do this, you can't see this, but we'll get you a slide here. And if you take a look at the United States today, just to put it in perspective, and you will be surprised about this, that there is a regional greenhouse gas program.
Right.
There's California. There's 30 REC programs. We've had the biggest bull market in the history of the planet in gold. Yet, the North American carbon markets are 50% bigger than gold. Nobody knows this. Let me repeat this again very carefully. The open interest, the measure of how broad a market is in North American carbon, both voluntary, regional, and statewide, is 1.8 million contracts, and gold is 1.3. So it's not as if nothing is going on. There's a lot going on. It's just ground up. It's not top down. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the success of markets in the U.S., it is positively correlated to the distance from Washington, D.C. So the further away you go from Washington, the more likely you're going to have a successful carbon market. California, state of Washington,
Good life advice there.
Texas, et cetera. So don't be reading the front page. If you pick up yesterday's Wall Street Journal, the Saturday, Sunday, there's a little article. Don't read the headlines. Go to the back, and there's an article about carbon capture. And Warren Buffett, Occidental Petroleum, just is starting a big carbon capture thing. So please don't think that this is relegated to the back stove. It's just in the back pages, not the back stove. And that's where the truth lies as a trader. Don't look at headlines. They're yesterday's news.
Well, as you're writing the book, when you started around the time I started, you were a few years ahead of me.
I'm much older, Bruce.
Yeah, just a couple years. There just weren't a lot of climate solutions out there. There wasn't that much to invest in. There wasn't a lot of ways to reduce emissions. Today, there's thousands of technologies and tools like AI to help us. Let's open up to questions. We have about 15 minutes together. Yeah, please.
Hey, hi everyone. My name is Ari. I work at the Climate Knowledge Initiative, but I actually got my start in carbon markets. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Good.
A lot of the things you said resonated with me, but it's interesting because you mentioned back then it felt like digging in the trenches. Still very much does. And you made a point about there's not only no reward for the companies that are taking the risk. In my experience, it feels like the risk compounds and there's punishments for taking risks in many cases, especially engaging in the voluntary carbon markets. And there's just an extraordinary lack of stability, I think, in what participation in these markets feels like. You mentioned policy, and I think when there's a market like California that has policy backing it up, it's a lot clearer what the path forward is, and there's a lot more comfort in participating in these markets and taking risks. How would you bring that stability into voluntary carbon markets? Or I guess what's your godfather for the voluntary carbon market?
I think what Paul and I did with CCX, the big problem is it's got no teeth. Okay, and when Paul and I were talking about this, we called up FINRA. And FINRA is the agency that regulates JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, and they did audits. And we were very careful to have credible verification and monitoring. The other thing that we were careful to do, and it's a very important lesson to do, is we, within the fine details of the exchange, we have fines which I will term constructively ambiguous. And let me tell you what that means. If you violate a rule and the fine is $10,000, the calculus is very simple. If I can make more than $10,000, I will violate the rule. If I make less than $10,000, I'll adhere to the rule. If you make the rule fuzzy and say, I am going to fine you an indeterminate amount depending on your intentions, and if your intentions are pernicious and you try to undermine your fellow members, this is the endowment effect. You go to trial and they can fine you not 10,000, they can fine you $1 million if they figure that you are doing it for pernicious reasons. And so the idea was to make a rule book that created problems for you if you didn't adhere to the rules, and then a trial by your peers which could have deadly penalties if you were violating the club and the spirit of the club, which was to do something. So my advice, and this has come up with Paula and I when we did the Prime conference, has come up at other times. What do you do? And if we could redo the voluntary market today, we do it with teeth, and big, powerful, I mean shark teeth.
I mean, the VCM is not what CCX was. CCX was a voluntary but legally binding cap and trade, which is different than what we call today the VCM, which is a basket of bilateral agreements that can come and go. The only risk is reputational, and the only risk may be financial. But in CCX, what Richard just said, these companies could be fined. And, you know, you have a macro job and a micro job in your life, right? The macro job is to get these markets linked up. And however you lobby and however you know, whoever you know, buy them flowers. California and Reggie should be linked up with China. This is a big policy lift. But you have to lobby for that if you care about these things. But in the day-to-day, you just have to talk about how positive it is. The science is not stopping. The scarcity is every day greater. And, you know, the planet is not going to make it. The weather data, everything about it. And so it's insanity to ignore the science. And then you throw policy on top of that and capital, and then you have a solution.
Good advice. Let's we'll go around. We'll do
Good
Nikki
luck.
and some more work around the room. Sorry, Nikki, and then no.
Yeah, thanks both so much. I've also been working in the carbon markets for the past 4 or 5 years. So thank you for all of your work, and it's really interesting to hear the origins around it. Based upon my work, I think I have a couple, 2 existential questions that always come up in the markets, and I'm just curious your view. The first is around commoditization of carbon and whether or not it should be like integrated into the commodity markets as that type of an asset, similar to gold, similar to oil, etc., or if it is something different that needs to encompass social benefits. It's a different type of an asset. Should it go on the balance sheet? Should it not? My second is around whether or not you all have views of, it sounds like what you were doing at CCX was a lot of scope 1 and 2 reductions and encouraging like integrated planning within that chain versus scope 3. So I'm curious your thoughts around, and
You could opt in scope 3 if
you could opt in
wanted.
scope 3. And so,
But you had to opt all of them in, not just the ones who are easy to
The
reduce.
goodies.
yeah. I'm curious kind of the complexities or your views around how difficult it is in scope 3, and if you think about, kind of the trading from the perspective of working with other companies to offset with removals, avoidance, etc. So I'm curious your thoughts on that too.
I think number one, we've always, and Paul and I were driven by the concept that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Okay, that there's too many people trying to design a 747 as the first airplane. The Wright brothers got off the ground for 60 seconds. They didn't have safety belts. They didn't have seat lights. They didn't have stewardesses. They just wanted to get the sucker to fly. So that's number one. Number two, forgetting, and I'm going to use this to answer your first question, which is carbon as an asset. The important thing is to get a benchmark, and let me give you my experience. And the first thing I designed, I got to Chicago in May of '72 as a professor on sabbatical. And in '73, there was a worldwide crisis, the Arab oil embargo, food prices, Nixon era inflation. It was really insane. So I said, oh my God, we should design a bread wheat contract at the Chicago Board of Trade. And I was 30 and stupid enough to think that I could somehow do something that somebody hadn't thought about. And so I designed a export wheat contract. And it failed like a lead balloon. Again, 606 Salverson, one of these things. And so the thing failed. And then it took me over about 10 to 20 years to realize that I had gotten benchmarks all wrong, because the Chicago Board of Trade trades cookie wheat. That's 400 million bushels. Big interest to Pillsbury and Betty Crocker and the bakery, but of no interest to people who want noodles or who want bread. This crop is 400 million bushels. The world production of wheat is 30 billion. If you want to know the price in let's say, Munich of wheat, you take this cookie wheat in Chicago, you figure out how much it's going to cost you to freight and handle it down to Mississippi, export it from Louisiana to Rotterdam, take it to Rotterdam, and then rail it to Munich, and you add another 35 cents for freight and handling, ocean freight, barge freight, all of that stuff, and you get the price of wheat in Munich, all based on a cookie. Okay, so the important thing, but a regulated market, and you would add a differential. Well, wheat in the ground is more hard. So you got to get a benchmark that people believe in. And so even if it's not the principal part about it, and that's why we went for 6 gases and not 1 gas. And if you do that. Second of all, you probably don't know. Bruce and I know a guy who's in the voluntary market today, that by latest account, as of last week, we were able to identify 80 hedge funds that own carbon as an asset. Let me say that again. 80 hedge funds that own carbon. I don't know, you wouldn't have bought, if you bought let's say Microsoft in '86 when it went public, you might have done well, and you might have done well if you bought NVIDIA 5 years from now. The history of markets, it's all about expectations, and you get it right, and it looks hard, but somebody's going to look back 15 years from now, and somebody's going to look in Carbon's trading in Shanghai and spot and in Guangdong futures and say, I could have bought voluntary carbon at $8 a ton. It's trading at 200, Why didn't I buy that? So I think there's a lot more going on. And yes, it's hard, but that's where, as for the business and climate students, that's where you make money as a contrarian, when it's not obvious to other people.
Yeah. Otherwise, money's already been made. Let's see one more quick question from Elizabeth. So time.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. Thank you both so much for being here. I just had a question about corporate actors, because Paula, you were talking about going around in person, talking to all these folks back in the early 2000s and how receptive and open they were. I'm curious if you feel like where that shifted, more receptive, less receptive, or kind of how the role of the corporate actor may have changed.
That's a good question. I think, first of all, it got harder. In '92, it was a linear problem. Emissions going up, all we have to do is bring them down. Well, when we started trying to do that, it became harder and harder. But you had a different view of what the corporation was supposed to be about, that it had a social component. And also, I think today, back to lean and mean, we don't have a middle, I say I went in person, and Richard certainly did as well, but you could get a meeting with people. And there were people in the room who had room to fail and would say, let's say Bruce is the boss, they could go and they say, look, these two crazy people came in, this is the plus, this is the minus, and they would kick around. And he wouldn't fire them if he thought the idea was crazy. But the stakes, there's so much less cushion now in a corporate structure, I think, from what I observe, because I do a lot of this now in a different way, where a new idea can't land. It just comes in and glances off. So that's one thing. The other thing is, don't underestimate the problem of turnover. I did. I thought we were done. I thought we did CCX, then there's the EU ETS. I mean, it'll just keep going, right? But it got harder and harder and harder. And all that leadership training of that generation of leaders flipped into another goal. And so this is where it's a balance between science, policy, and capital. Sometimes you need a federal regulation. Sometimes you won't have one. But meanwhile, the science is ticking. And so you have to look for the people who want to dance with you. You dance with the ones who brought you to the party, and that's who you dance with. And so I think we do have a leadership gap, but recruiting, it was a lot of fun. It wasn't easy, but it would be a lot, possibly, I said to Richard just a minute ago, in a way, I think it could be easier to recruit today, because I think people would feel one and done. Yeah, we'll get it, that'll cover our reputational risk, our price risk, all of our risk. We'll just join CCX and we'll sign the thing and nobody will ask us for anything else. I would have killed for that attitude in '03. And that may be the simple attitude now. So I wouldn't rule out that we could do it again. It's just maybe a different set of arguments. And I was just at a conference here last week with a lot of private equity people who are doing sustainability fairly seriously as part of their exit strategies, looking for every conceivable kind of efficiency. The next book we should call is Efficiency Hunters. They're very concerned about regulatory risk. And then when you look at the technologies available, there's so much possibility to mitigate, the risk. And you can make reductions. It's just harder and more expensive than it was then. And back to what you said about I think the Scope 3 thing, off the record, is completely exaggerated and confused and complicated by environmental perfection. And it doesn't matter if you bike to work. It doesn't matter if you offset your airplane. The atmosphere doesn't care what you do or why you do it. And,
Let me take that to
The
the
last comment. 'cause
the,
we-
the
we're
last
gonna get to
comment,
question, like-
because I think Paula hit it all in the head, and she's involved in CDP and stuff like that. And just remember that to squeeze the last ounce through scope 3 is not going to be helpful. And keep in mind that if you add Europe and all of its countries to the U.S., it is 60% of China. Okay, so if we're going to get a handle on this problem, the real big challenge is to get China involved. And as Paula alluded to, we think a linkage to China to some North American market would be an open end. But I just want to, Bruce, the last word is Paul and I have been on this mission. We've had a lot of fun with it. We've been to backwaters all over the world. This is a great opportunity for all of you. And the biggest advice we could give is what we did was focus. When Napoleon said to his generals after chiding them through the Austrian campaign, he called them together and I said to them, when I told you to take Vienna, I mean, take Vienna. I didn't mean Salzburg. I didn't mean the suburbs. I meant take Vienna. Focus, focus, focus. Keep up your idea. If you focus on pricing carbon in an intelligent way, you're going to do it. And you are the future. And in all of the groups that Paul and I spoke to, it's your world and you can do it. There's still lots of opportunities. So let me end.
Richard and Paul, I'm glad you get the backwater. The backwater of New York City. Yeah.
Thank you.